Hello, this is Dr. Andy Pulte. I'm glad that you're joining me here today for this lecture on nomenclature and morphology of plants. We're basically going to learn today the basics of plant identification from the very beginning. We're going to do that in a variety of different ways, but we are going to get started here with some learning objectives and really what we want you to do by the end of this lecture. And if you, for some reason, can't answer these questions by the end of the lecture, probably a good idea to go back and review some of this material. The first one, describe why the use of scientific names are important. Gain a working knowledge of terminology used in the identification of plants. And then also identify morphological characteristics of plants that are used in identification. So there's a lot of words in there. Some you may be familiar with, some you might not be familiar with. But we're going to go through each one of these kind of slowly in a variety of different ways once again. So get these learning objectives down and make sure that you do go back and review them over time. So what system do we use to identify plants? Well, we use something called the binomial nomenclature system, and that was developed by a Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus in the late 1700s. And that really is basically where we are going to give every living thing on the planet two names, two names. And that's what we're really going to dive into today. Here's a statue at the Chicago Botanic Garden that features Carl Linnaeus because he is such an important figure in science, a very important figure in this world of identifying plants. And so the first thing we're going to do just to start us out is I'm going to share my screen in a little bit of a different way here. And we're going to watch just a small video that features Carl Linnaeus.
Carl Linnaeus was born in the southern Swedish province of Småland in 1707 and is considered to be one of the most influential scientists of his time. His life's work was to develop and refine a way to group life on Earth, or to classify it. So straightforward was his system, it is still used by scientists and understood by people across the world today. His father, Nils Ingmarsson Linnaeus, was both an avid gardener and a Lutheran pastor, and Carl showed a deep love of plants and a fascination with their names from a very early age. While studying medicine at both the universities of Lund and the University of Uppsala in Sweden, he devoted a large amount of his time to the study of plants, and in 1732 he mounted a botanical expedition to Lapland. Over 5 months, he traveled some 3,000 miles, collecting biological specimens and taking notes. In 1734, he mounted another expedition to central Sweden.
He was an empiricist. He didn't believe things that he hadn't seen with his own eyes. He was very reluctant to take on trust something that somebody had written about.
In 1735, Linnaeus moved to the Netherlands, and it was in that same year that he published his most well-known work, the Systema Naturae, or the System of Nature. In it, he outlined a new system for the naming of all living things.
There are, I guess, there are two main things that Carl Linnaeus tends to be known for. The one is, as far as his classification systems, which at the time were really rather revolutionary, particularly in the plant kingdom, rather less so amongst the animals. And the second thing is his introduction of a new naming system using a genus name and a species name, the so-called binomial system. Now, of the two, it's the latter. It's the naming system that is his primary legacy.
This item is the first edition of Systema Naturae, the one where Linnaeus actually outlines his sexual system for classifying plants, basically by the number of stamens and the arrangement of the reproductive organs. So this is the first time it's appeared in print, and so that's why it's important. You can see it's very large, and I tend to explain it as being the 18th century version of an Excel spreadsheet, because you can see it's very table-like. By the time the 10th edition appeared in 1758, this had shrunk from this really large size to a much more sort of portable thing, but it had gone from only 11 pages to 2 fat volumes.
Returning to Sweden in 1738, he practiced medicine, specializing in the treatment of syphilis, and lectured in Stockholm, before being awarded a professorship at Uppsala University in 1741. Throughout his life, Linnaeus showed an interest in nature and the systems which govern it. He wrote not just about classification, but also about ecology, how organisms interact with their environment. He explored food chains and even defined the concept of race, dividing humans into 4 groups: Americanus, Asiaticus, Africanus, and Europeanus. Forced to retire from teaching in 1774 by a stroke, Linnaeus suffered a further stroke and eventually died in 1778. Linnaeus was driven by a lust for all nature and the desire to understand and classify it. His legacy remains and is used by the many dedicated scientists today who are driven by that same desire.
And so here we're back to the statue of Carl Linnaeus. And so we are going to be primarily focused on these taxonomic units within our study in this class. The families of plants, the genera of the plant, and the species of plants. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get into this lecture. But the binomial nomenclature really just gives 2 Latin names that describe a specific species. And so here is how that's broken down. The first part of a scientific name is the genus. And I've given an example of one there, ACER, and that's Acer, and that would be the genus of all maples. If you see something that you call maple, a lot of us are familiar with maple because we like maple syrup. So we're going to start by using maple as an example, and Acer is one of them. The specific epithet is the second part of that scientific name. And so if you put that top one together, the genus and the species, the genus and the specific epithet comes together to make the species, which would be Acer rubrum. And so the genus and the specific epithet together makes up the species together. And I always tell people this, but a lot of scientific names in your everyday life, and you actually use scientific names in your everyday life. And a lot of you out there know the scientific name of this creature right here, and of course it's Tyrannosaurus rex. And what does Tyrannosaurus rex mean? Well, it means tyrant lizard or king of the lizards. And so you do know and use scientific names in your everyday life. Homo sapien, Tyrannosaurus rex, boa constrictor, maybe geranium are some that you use. And all these are scientific names. Now, we typically or oftentimes hear these referred to as the Latin names of plants or animals, but that's not always the case. They can be from many different languages, and some scientific names are, as I've written here, ancient Greek, Aztec, Mongolian, and other different languages they come from, but a lot of them are derived from Latin, but that's not always 100% the case. We're going to be going through 2 broad groups of plants as we talk that I want you to be familiar with, and the first one is angiosperms. Angiosperms often referred to as flowering plants, and angiosperm literally means covered seed. An example of an angiosperm would be an apple. It's a flowering plant that flowers. It produces a fruit, and inside of an apple you're very familiar with, it has that flesh-covered seed. Gymnosperms are what we think of as pine trees, conifers, cone-bearing plants. There's a lot more to it than that, but those are great examples. And that literally means naked seed. And so we need to start by just kind of knowing these 2 broad classifications of plants. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more in depth. And so here's those 2 different groups of plants broken out into the flowering and the non-flowering plants. Of course, there where you see non-flowering, that would be the gymnosperms, and flowering, that's where you would see the angiosperms. And the angiosperms, those flowering plants, the monocots, which would be all grasses, and the dicots, which is all those really kind of traditional flowering plants that we think of. The big flowers, the apple would be one, is there, and that makes up the majority of the plants on the planet. And there on the left, you see the gymnosperms. And that's, it's everything from pine trees to ferns. These are all different non-flowering plants. Okay, so I'm going to take 1 second here. I'm going to switch back over to YouTube, and I am going to give you another video that really is going to in a lot of ways give you just the introduction to what we're going to talk about today in a little bit different way. And so just kind of as a learning exercise, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a video on what we're going to learn today, and then I'm going to teach it to you in traditional PowerPoint format. That way, I hope everybody gets a little bit more out of it. So here we go, just a little bit of an intro video on the introduction of plants. So why is it important to learn the scientific names of plants? First, it's amazing to think that every plant and animal and even fossils have been given scientific names. And we use the binomial nomenclature system, which means that each plant and animal has been given two names that describes that plant or animal. Well, of course, we're most concerned with plants, but I think that in your everyday life, you already know some scientific names, maybe one like Tyrannosaurus rex, boa constrictor. These are all the scientific names of things that we know. But plants, of course, have scientific names as well. And when we use the scientific name of a plant, we are using a universal language, and it doesn't matter what country we're in or where we're at in the world, the scientific name is a common language that we can use to communicate with others. When we start learning plants, one of the things that I think is critically important is to understand terminology. So let's start at the top with two big groups of plants, and that's angiosperm and gymnosperm. Here in my hand is a classic example of an angiosperm. Angiosperm literally means covered seed. And this is a little crabapple in the genus Malus, and you can imagine that these little fruits have seeds inside of them, and they're covered by this exterior flesh. Now, this is a pretty good evolutionary adaptation because this is a very mobile, movable way to spread your genes throughout the world. And people do that, animals do that in a variety of ways. And this is a classic example of a gymnosperm. This is a little Japanese black pine, and you can see that it has pine cones on it. Well, this is a gymnosperm. Gymnosperm literally means naked seed. And when these pine cones dry up and they dehisce or open up, the seeds literally just fall straight down to the ground. It doesn't have quite the ability to spread its genes from one place to another that one of the classic examples like this flowering plant, this angiosperm, has. And so we want to start with this little piece of terminology. Let's dive into the next pieces of terminology we're going to use when we're identifying plants. And in my hand, I've got a herbaceous plant and I've got a woody plant. So herbaceous and woody. Woody plants, I think people are most familiar with. These are trees and shrubs, things that maintain a woody stem year-round. That is really the definition of a woody plant. It maintains a woody stem year-round. This big holly behind me is a woody tree. Now, right here in my hand is a little piece of sedum here. The cultivar is Autumn Joy, and this is a herbaceous plant. This herbaceous plant dies back down to the ground completely in the wintertime. It has got a fleshy stem, and again, it dies back down to the ground completely in the wintertime. The next piece of terminology we need to get a hold of is deciduous versus evergreen. Now, deciduous means simply that it loses its leaves in the wintertime. And so I have an oak in my hand, and this oak, when it becomes wintertime, the leaves will fall off of the tree. Behind me, there's a holly, and this is considered an evergreen plant. In fact, it's a broad-leaved evergreen plant, and it will maintain its leaves year-round. Now, maintaining your leaves year-round doesn't necessarily mean that you keep a leaf that you grow forever. This holly will shed leaves in a cycle and continuously be shedding leaves and then also growing new leaves during the growing season. One more piece of terminology we really need to get a hold of is the difference between simple leaves and compound leaves. I have a compound leaf that I'm showing to you right now. And the way that you determine if a leaf is simple or compound is you look for the buds or the nodes, and then you go from there. And so as I investigate onto this stem, I see that there's actually only buds and nodes right here along the stem. And then all above this, where these other little leaflets are, there's actually no buds or nodes. And so this whole entire structure right here is one leaf, and we call it a compound leaf. Now here I've got an oak in my hand, and I look down at the oak along the stem, and I see buds, and then I see a leaf arising from that bud. And so this right here, this is also an example of just one leaf. And so this is called a simple leaf, and this is called a compound leaf. Now, there's another piece of terminology you need to really clue in on if you want to get good at identifying plants, and that's leaf arrangement. Again, leaf arrangement. There's two main leaf arrangements that I want you to be concerned with. Now, there are other classifications of leaf arrangement, but there's two main ones that I want you to be concerned with. That's alternate and opposite. Alternate or opposite. This one that I've got in my hand here, I've got a stem. These are simple leaves, and they are alternately arranged on the stem, meaning that they don't come off the stem right across from each other. Now, I'm going to go over to this maple, and this maple is oppositely arranged, meaning that the leaves come off the stem completely opposite from each other. Now, I'm cluing into where the bud is or where the node is, and that's where I make my determination. So where does knowing leaf arrangement come in handy? Well, I've got a great example here in my hand. Right here, this is a maple, and I know that everything in the genus Acer, or all maples, have opposite leaf arrangement. Well, on my other hand, I've got an oak, and I know that everything in the genus Quercus, or oaks, has alternate leaf arrangement. And so this helps me as I'm out identifying plants to be able to tell the difference between major groups of plants. Now, it doesn't always work. You have to really know your stuff, but just in this case, these two very common plants, maples and oaks, I can tell the difference between these automatically. Now, in almost all of our plant identification videos, we give you a general height and width of each one of these plants, and also what zone these plants are hardy in. Now, this is based on historical information, but also just personal experience of the person talking. And so you need to take that a little bit with a grain of salt and really get to know a plant in your own region of the country. Okay. Just so everybody knows, we do have a YouTube channel. It's called Plant Sleuth, and that is where you'll be able to see a lot of the videos that we use for this class in particular, but I use them for other classes as well, and it actually contains about 400 different videos, all on different plants. And so that's a great resource that people can use for identifying plants. So let me switch back over to sharing my screen with the PowerPoint on it. And so we answer this question in the video, but why is it important to learn plant names? Why bother with their scientific names? Of course, when you're talking scientific names, you're using a common language. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. If you use the scientific name of a plant, you've got a common language that you share with scientists, other gardeners, and a variety of different things. But also the scientific names tell you a little bit about the plants in some cases. We might see as part of a scientific name words like alba or rubrum. Alba means white, rubrum means red. Maybe the scientific name might tell you where that plant is from. Something like japonica, which would of course mean that's from Japan, or sinensis, which means that that's from the area that we commonly call China. It might tell you a little bit about what the plant looks like, its habit or its form. Maybe it's horizontalis. There's a plant, Juniperus horizontalis, and that's a very low, flat-growing plant. Or maybe it's something like Cryptomeria japonica globosa nana, which would have the word globosa in it, which tells you that that's a rounded shape like a globe. And so the scientific names of plants really do tell us a little bit about the plants. Each one is unique. There's no two different plants that are given the same scientific name, but common names are not unique. You may call a plant something in one region of the country and something else in a different region of the country, but they do not hold true throughout different countries, throughout even our own country. And so you want to be using the scientific names of plants. So as we get kind of an introduction into it, this is way too long to read on this PowerPoint video, so you could pause me and read this whole thing if you'd like to. But it really talks about the fact that it's really important as we begin the process of learning plants to know terminology, to understand the relationship between plants, to know how plants are classified into broad and narrow groups, and why we do that. But why, and part of that previous slide was saying that, we tend to look at the flower structure, and you heard in the Linnaeus video them talking about the different stamens and the different ways that Linnaeus classified plants. Botanists use the flower structure, the inflorescence, the reproductive structure to classify plants really above almost anything. Now, things have changed a little bit with the advent of DNA and being able to classify plants by DNA. But we really do and always have really looked at the flower structures because they are the least changed uh, based on geographic location of a plant, based on the weather that particular year. The reproductive structure tends to change the least in different environments, and so that's a good reason why uh, the to use the flower structure as really the beginning of classification. And so if you start looking at plants that are in similar or in the same family, you might notice that they've got similar flowers. You look at the plants that are different species, but in the same genus, you might start looking at their flowers to see the similarities of their flowers. When you're out in different gardens throughout the world, you're going to see a lot of plants are labeled. They've got labels on them that tell you about the scientific name. This would be a great time to pause this slide and kind of look at these different parts of a plant label that you might see out in a public garden or a place that you can go to learn plants. If you paused, welcome back. But I want to give you some examples of scientific names. So let's look at these three on the top. Acer saccharinum, Acer platanoides, and Acer rubrum. So that first part, the genus, tells me that this is something that we typically call a maple. So everything in the genus Acer is maple. And the first one, Acer saccharinum, we commonly call this silver maple. So the specific epithet tells me what kind of maple that is. And here's just some examples of, in particular, some here in the genus Acer and some different types of acers or different types of maples. When we write scientific names, we have to be very careful because there is some specifics to how you write scientific names. You might look here at the word Acer and you see that the genus is capitalized. You always capitalize the genus. And the specific epithet, which is right here, is always written in lowercase. And you may notice that it's been underlined. You can do it one of two ways, and that's shown down here. This one's underlined. Or you can write it in italics. Of course, if you're hand printing something, you cannot write in italics, and so you'd want to underline that. So that's kind of the specific way that you write a scientific name. Now, I told you that that scientific names tell you a little bit about plants, but let's dive into that a little bit deeper. This plant, Metasequoia glyptostroboides, long scientific name, Metasequoia glyptostroboides. Now, let's talk about this plant and what that means. So this plant was actually only known in the fossil record, till kind of the early part of the 20th century. And when it was discovered as a fossil, it was given a scientific name. When it was discovered as a fossil, it was given a scientific name, and the name it was given was Metasequoia glyptostroboides. So let me tell you about another plant, a completely different plant, and it is called Glyptostrobus. And Glyptostrobus always has had fossils that we find of Glyptostrobus, but also living representations. And so it has living and extinct species within this genus Glyptostrobus. And it is a deciduous conifer. It is a gymnosperm that actually loses its needles, unlike what we're familiar with pine trees. Well, lo and behold, a living specimen of Metasequoia was found. I believe it was found against this temple in China. Since then, a couple more have been found, but one was actually found. The seeds were shipped to the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. They distributed them. And most of the Metasequoia glyptostroboides, the dawn redwoods, which is the common name, in the United States are descended from that original tree. So here it is. Here's really what it looks like. Here's the leaves of it. Here's the little cones of it. And here's what a living example of that tree looks like. It gets quite large. It's a big plant. So let's look at that scientific name. Metasequoia glyptostroboides, or dawn redwood. Metasequoia glyptostroboides. Well, what does meta mean? And in this case, it means a different order of what? Sequoia, Metasequoia. So it's a different kind of sequoia. And some of you may be familiar with the giant sequoias that we see out in California, that kind of thing. But it's not saying that it is a sequoia. It's just saying it's a different kind of sequoia, or it likens to a sequoia. And what does this mean? Glyptostroboides. That looks like Glyptostrobus. So the scientific name, if you break this down, it's a different kind of sequoia that looks like Glyptostrobus. And of course, the sequoias, that's the redwood group, is a subfamily in the family Cupressaceae, which has 3 different genera in it. And so here is what Glyptostrobus again looks like. I showed you a fossil before, but here's what it looks like kind of living. So let's put these things next to each other. Here's Metasequoia, the one that we only knew as a fossil, and then here's Glyptostrobus here. So the question is, did they do a good job? Yeah, I think that they did a good job, even when they were describing this plant as a fossil. Now, in order to successfully identify plants, it's necessary to have a basic working knowledge of taxonomic terminology and an understanding of leaves, buds, stems, flowers, and different fruit characteristics that are an important part of identifying plants. Now, we went through this in the video, but let's talk about it now. There's different plant types. The first group that we want to talk about is woody plants. And these are plants that have woody stems that remain year-round. So we think about oak trees as a big woody plant. And within woody plants, there's deciduous ones. These lose their leaves every year. There's evergreen ones. These ones have leaves that remain year-round. Again, they shed leaves or needles in cycles. They always have needles on them, however. Herbaceous plants, they have fleshy stems that die to the ground in winter. 3 main classifications of herbaceous plants are annual, perennial, and biennial. Annual means that it completes its life cycle in 1 year and then dies down to the ground. Perennial means that it can persist year after year. Now, that doesn't mean that a perennial lasts for 100 years. It would still be a perennial if it lasted 3 or 4 years, but it's a plant that can persist year after year. It dies down to the ground in the wintertime and then reemerges in the spring. And a biennial completes its life cycle in 2 years. And now the typical life cycle of a biennial would be you plant a seed, the seed sprouts. The first year it's basically all foliage, dies down to the ground, or in some cases it dies down to the ground, then reemerges in the spring, and then flowers, then it completes its life cycle. If we go back up to number 1 there where it says annual, an annual, basically the definition of that is it completes its life cycle in 1 year. It goes from seed all the way back around to seed in 1 year. You plant a seed, it grows, it flowers, it produces seed, and then it's done with its life. And so that's what an annual is. We spent quite a bit of time on this in the video, but what is a true leaf? A true leaf will have a bud at its base. The position of the bud determines whether the leaf is simple or compound. Simple or compound. And you remember me holding up one leaf that was really kind of feathery, and then I held up an oak leaf that was just basically one leaf. If the bud is located at the base of a leaf containing multiple leaflets, that would be leaf-like structures that do not contain buds. It is termed a compound leaf. And that can be as many as 1,500 leaflets. It can be a very big thing. So let's look at that in this way. Here's a simple leaf on the left, and you can see as I move my cursor down here, it has a bud on it. Here's the petiole, and then you see this leaf, the blade up above with a midrib. Because the bud's down here, this is all just one leaf. But then you'll also run into leaves where there's a bud at the base, but then it's got all these little structures on the top called leaflets. And when that happens, it's called a compound leaf. Here's some examples of compound leaves. One is pinnately compound, and you can see that here. Twice pinnately compound, where it's split again. Again, there would only be a bud here and a bud here. Or you may even see palmately compound, which of course is like the palm of your hand. There's just a bud down here, but there are no nodes, there are no buds in this area. And so those are some classifications that you see there on the screen. Pinnate, bipinnate, tripinnate, all different ways that we can classify compound leaves. And so let's look at this one. Here's a bipinnately compound leaf. There would be a bud up here, but there's no little buds in here. So on this screen, if I were to ask you how many leaves are in this photo, the answer would be that there's just one leaf in this entire photo. Gymnosperm leaf types. We talked about gymnosperms being plants with naked seeds. Gymnosperms typically display different leaf types than angiosperms, the flowering plants. Most but not all gymnosperms are conifers that have needle-like foliage, Exception would be ginkgo, which is kind of an interesting one. Most, but not all conifers have evergreen foliage, and there are some examples to that, some deciduous conifers. But hey, this is what we're familiar with, needles on gymnosperms on pine trees, because many conifers have needle-like foliage. Pines in particular display their foliage in needles and in bundles of needles. This little structure that I'm circling right here, this is called a fascicle. And this fascicle bundles needles together. And we can count the needles that are in those bundles, and that helps us identify plants. For example, this one has five needles in it. So that makes me think, of our native eastern white pine, which has bundles in 5. And so that's one way that we can identify plants. But you'll also see other ones. Here's some what they call all-like foliage, scale-like foliage. We don't need to get into the weeds on this too much, but you do need to know that these kind of things exist. Nodes are particular points along the stem where buds and leaves exist. And so, that's what we're looking at to see if a leaf, if there's a simple leaf or a compound leaf. We're looking for that node where that bud is. But the arrangement of those buds or nodes are important to help us figure out what the leaf arrangement is. Those leaves, those buds or those nodes are important to help us understand what the leaf arrangement is. There are 4 basic different types of leaf arrangement: opposite, alternate, subopposite, and whorled. And we're going to go through those, very kind of individually, and we're going to talk about them. So leaf arrangement, again, so before we were talking about leaf type, is it simple or compound? That's leaf type. Here is leaf arrangement, and that means how do they come off the stem? And so the first one, opposite leaf arrangement, you can see the buds or the nodes. We know that there's one leaf here, there's another leaf here, there's 2 leaves in this picture, and they are oppositely arranged. These buds come off of the stem directly across from each other. They're oppositely arranged. But we'll also see buds that are staggered from each other, and they come off the leaf, and they're alternately arranged. So that term alternate leaf arrangement helps us know a little bit more about this plant. We might see some that are subopposite out in the world. Here's where they're just kind of barely split off of each other. That's sometimes a hard call to know if it's alternate or if it's subopposite. So typically you'll see the things classified more likely as alternate than subopposite. You may see some that are whorled, where there are 3 or more buds and leaves arranged at a single node or a different at one place on the stem, and that is something that you will run into. And so leaf type and leaf arrangement, both very important pieces of terminology that you need to know. The leaf shape, what the leaf actually looks like, a huge variety of different leaf shapes out there in the world. And for identification purposes, it's important to be familiar with some of the most common leaf shapes and the terms used to describe them. Now, for class, you wouldn't have to memorize all these leaf shapes. I'm just going to go through them. And you can see sometimes they're very descriptive. Lanceolate. Oh, what does it look like? It kind of looks like a lance. There's a lot of different leaf shapes out there in the world. And being familiar with some of them is important. Now, for this class and our needs, do you need to memorize these leaf shapes? No, absolutely not. But it's important to know that there's some different ones out there. But it is, I think, important to know leaf terminology. What are these different parts of the leaf? What is a petiole? What is the base of a leaf? What do we call these veins? What do we call the center midrib? What's the top of the leaf? Well, that's the apex. If a leaf kind of dips in like this, what do we call it? It's the sinus of the leaf. And so knowing those pieces of terminology, this would be a good time to pause this video and maybe even sketch this yourself so you can see a little bit more and understand a little bit more about pieces of the leaf, the terminology of the leaf that helps us identify plants. The outside edge of the leaf, it is called the leaf margin. The outside edge of the leaf is called the leaf margin. And there's a variety of different things that we call the edges of leaves or the leaf margins. Here's one. This one is called entire, and that just means that it's completely smooth. And so that's one piece of terminology. Dentate, you can see it's like very toothy. It's a very toothy edge. Do you need to know all these for class? No, but we do call these different margins of leaves different things. And the same is true for the bases of the leaves. There's all different things that we call the bases of leaves. There's all different things that we call the tips of the leaf or the apex of the leaf. And it's just important to know that out in the world of plant identification, that we do call these things by specific names. Now, STEM terminology I feel is a little bit more important. STEM characteristics are valuable features to help identify woody plants in particular, especially in the wintertime. You know, you might be called upon to identify a plant not just in the summertime, not just when it's blooming, not when it just has leaves on it, but in the wintertime. And so STEM characteristics come into handy quite a bit. Uh, and we want you to know, what is a terminal bud, a lateral bud, bud scales, lenticels, pith. You see all those on the screen here. This would be a great time to pause this video to get these pieces of terminology down. And so here are the actual pith types, the actual parts of the stem that you might need to know how to classify on a stem. And so again, a good time to pause this video. I'd love you to know this, like what is a terminal bud? What is a leaf scar? That's where a leaf was. What's a lateral bud off the side here? Sometimes stems have these little dots on them. We call those lenticels. These different parts of the actual bud that look like basically like a corn cob. We call those bud scales. And then there's this little vascular bundle trace underneath the bud. And so there's a lot of different things, parts of the stem that are good to know and be able to classify. Flower characteristics as well are important because, as mentioned before, flower morphology, or the parts of the flower, is a big way that we classify plants. We often refer to the flower as the inflorescence, which is the arrangement of individual flowers into a specific pattern or a single flower structure in itself. And so 2 diagrams coming up that tell you the different parts of the flower. I'd love for you to pause the video and study this just a little bit. Here's a flower structure on a cross section. Again, a good time to pause this video and get some of these things down. Really back to junior high type botany stuff here, or early botany, early biology studies here, but just a good reminder for all of our students out there. Just like those leaf types, those leaf bases and leaf apexes, we call different inflorescences, different flowers, different things. And here's just some examples for you to be able to run through to see a little bit more of that. Here's an example. You might be familiar with this if you know the houseplant peace lily. Call this a Spathen spadix. But different parts of the flower here that help you kind of understand those a little bit. And the same is true with fruit. Many different fruit types exist and are helpful in identifying plants. And just knowing a few of the different fruit types is important. What do we call these different fruit types? I think a lot of you are familiar with this schiziocarp here down here, which is what we see typically called as a whirlybird that you might see on a maple. Maybe you're familiar with this aggregate of samaras that are often what we see on the Tennessee state tree, the tulip poplar, or like aggregate of follicles. This is like a southern magnolia, different magnolias that you see. And so just knowing some of these different fruit types are important. I think a lot of people are familiar with acorns. That would be Quercus or oak trees. So habit and form, these are interchangeable terms. As we kind of get to the end here of knowing these different things about plants, habit and form, interchangeable terms that refer to the overall shape or the outline of the plant, which is something that we might use when we talk about identifying plants. And you might see round or conical or oval, columnar, spreading, habit. These are different terms that we use when we identify plants, that we kind of let you people know as we talk about the plants. Hey, what is the ultimate shape of this plant is it going to be like a column? Is it going to be straight up and down? Is it going to be taller than it is narrow? And so there's varying things that we use as we talk about these different forms or habits, but the term form or habit is what we use for these things. Texture, it refers to the overall appearance or feel of the plant and is important for people who are designing with plants in particular. And I give you 3 examples here of plant textures. Something could be fine textured. Plants usually have smaller leaves and appear frilly. Coarse textured plants usually have big bold leaves, or it might be somewhere in the middle, medium texture. So that's something that you might want to be familiar with, is that we use terminology that we talk about the texture, like, what is the overall look or feel of that plant. Sometimes we may run into varieties of plants, and varieties are naturally occurring variants within a species that have different characteristics from the typical member of a species. And the example that I'm giving you down here is Acer palmatum variety Atropurpurea. Acer palmatum variety Atropurpurea is the red leaf form of Japanese maple. Variety names are italicized or underlined, just like the scientific name of that plant. And you can pause here. This would be good to read all of this to give you a little bit more in-depth information on what a variety is. But let's go on, and let me give you just the example here. And so the Japanese maple, Acer palmatum, is native from Japan through the Korean peninsula all the way over into China, if you can picture that map in your head. And in most of its natural distribution, it's got these green leaves like this. But there are pockets where you can find a red or purple-leaved varietal of Japanese maple, and that's actually been given a different scientific name. Acer palmatum, we know that means it's a Japanese maple, and it's given this VAR designation, which is a variety, and it's been called Atropurpurea, which basically just means that it has red or purple leaves. And so there's different types of varietals that you can find out, but they are naturally occurring variants within the species. Cultivars are cultivated selections of a species chosen for a unique characteristic that remains constant when reproduced. I'm going to give you the example. We're just going to stick with maples here. An example would be Acer rubrum. That'd be, if you just look at Acer rubrum, this would be just the Japanese maple that you would find out in the wild. Acer rubrum, native to even Tennessee. And you might see this fanciful name at the end of it. And here's one, October Glory. Acer rubrum, written in single quotes, just like this, Acer rubrum, October Glory, is a cultivar of the red maple chosen for exceptional fall color. Cultivar names are not italicized or underlined and capitalized and written inside of single quotation marks. So here is that plant, Acer rubrum. This is what it looks like in the wild, but someone found in a cultivated situation this red maple that had nicer fall color than the species, and so it was given a cultivar name, October Glory. And so you'll run into that as well as you learn to study plants. And so, of course, if you've got questions about this lecture, you can feel free to reach out to me. But I've written down here hands-on learning. So the best way for you to go out and learn these things is to take your notes that you've gained from this class and go out and learn all of these pieces of terminology by looking at actual plants. And so go out, look at actual plants, look at these different things like leaf type, leaf arrangement, out in a garden near you, here on the University of Tennessee campus. The State Botanical Garden of Tennessee, the UT Gardens, is a great place to do that. But come on, do some hands-on learning because that really is the ultimate best way to learn these plants. Feel free to watch this video multiple times if you can to make sure that you do have these pieces of terminology down. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.